Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Green is the New Black, Our Water, Our Future, and Our Commitment. I'm Jennifer Caddick, Alliance for the Great Lakes Vice President of Communications and Engagement, and I'll be moderating today's conversation. Here in Chicago, I'm joined by Joel Bremeyer, Alliance for the Great Lakes President and CEO. Joining us from Cleveland are Matt Gray, who is the City of Cleveland Chief of Sustainability, and Crystal M.C. Davis, who's the Alliance for the Great Lakes Policy Director. And we will also be joined shortly by Toledo, Ohio Mayor Wade Kapsakevich. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items. We are excited to have over 300 people registered to join us for today's conversation. To limit background noise, all participant lines will be muted for the duration of the webinar. If you're a participant and you would like to ask a question, use the question box as shown here at any time during the webinar. We'll leave plenty of time for questions after the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Also, later today, everyone on this call will receive an email with links to a number of helpful resources, including a blog recapping the webinar, information on how to take action, and a recording of today's presentation. And now I'm going to turn it over to Joel Bremeyer, Alliance for the Great Lakes President and CEO. Joel?
Thank you, Jen, and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. We've got a really exciting lineup of speakers that I'm going to be honored to introduce in just a moment. But before I do that, I want to share with you just a few thoughts on why we're talking with you today and why this summer of 2019 is such a special moment for clean water and one that deserves your attention. This June, as you'll hear much more about soon, is the 50th anniversary of a fire on the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland that caught the nation's attention. It was not the only fire, but it's the one that really started a clean water movement in the United States. And this August is also the 5th anniversary of another event that put the Great Lakes on the national stage, the shutdown of the city of Toledo's drinking water system due to toxic algae. And this eliminated drinking water for more than 400,000 people for 2 days, and for smaller numbers of residents of Ohio and Ontario for many more days and weeks. Now, the Cuyahoga River fire that was broadcast and written about in Time magazine became a visual symbol of what Great Lakes communities and communities across the country were experiencing in their own local waters. Today in 2019, it is hard to imagine a living river being so polluted that it could catch on fire. And that is in large part because these events in 1969 sparked a movement that saw the passage of the Federal Clean Water Act and the creation of the United States Environmental Protection Agency. Those fundamental protections allowed the Great Lakes region and the people who live here to create a different reality, one where we don't sacrifice living waters, but we recognize that clean water needs to be at the center of our communities. And that's something that's worth celebrating. And if you're going to be in Cleveland later this month, you'll have many opportunities to do that. So it's worth asking today, why is it that an entire Great Lake can get so polluted that it's not only unsafe to swim in, but it's unsafe to drink even after it has been treated? Sometimes, is what we learned in 2014. And the answer is that our clean water policies and practices have not kept up with the reality on the ground. Lake Erie and the communities that rely on the lake are suffering because the clean water protections we've relied on for 50 years aren't sufficient to address the largest source of pollution that's causing the problem, agriculture. Today we're going to talk about a tale of two cities. Cleveland is the cornerstone of the emergence of clean water protections in the United States 50 years ago, and Toledo is evidence that the tools we built 50 years ago are simply not keeping up with the reality in the field. So while we have this conversation, we've got some excellent elected leaders and their representatives here with us today to talk about this. I want to remind you that we are a 501c3 organization, which means we are nonpartisan. So today's conversation will be a nonpartisan discussion. To guide our conversation today, we have 3 key water leaders who live and work near Lake Erie to make remarks and answer your questions. I'm going to introduce everybody who's with us today, and then they'll go through their comments, and then we'll move into opportunities for you to take action and questions and answers. First speaking today will be Matt Gray. Matt is the Chief of Sustainability for the City of Cleveland and deeply involved in planning for the anniversary of the Cuyahoga 1969. Crystal Davis, who is Policy Director for the Alliance for the Great Lakes, also located in Cleveland and working in Ohio and throughout the region on our clean water initiatives. And Toledo Mayor Wade Kapsakavich will be speaking about his experience at the center of the clean water crisis facing the Great Lakes today. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Matt Gray. Matt?
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Perfect, thanks.
Great. Thank you, Joel, and the Alliance, really, for this invitation today, and all you do, really, for the Great Lakes, for Lake Erie, and supporting cities like Cleveland. I thought I'd go, a little more in depth on the history that Joel teed up, connecting that to today and today's challenges. Talk a little bit about that Cuyahoga 50 work that we're doing and that celebration, and then just a tad on the Mayor Frank Jackson, Mayor of Cleveland's initiatives connected to all of this. So that history, so that was the morning of June 22nd, 1969. A spark, dropped from a train near our steel plant, passing over the river, and really for the 13th documented time over the previous century, it caught fire. And really what followed certainly changed Cleveland, and some would argue really the world and certainly the nation forever. By the time the Cuyahoga caught fire for the last time, it had literally no life. There's pretty much no oxygen in the water. But in many ways, that wasn't anything new, in 69. And of course, there were many fires on many rivers in the U.S. Of course, Cleveland got known for it. And as I kind of been reading more and more about this, one of the craziest stats that I found is, the first of those fires in the Cuyahoga took place in 1868. And just thinking back in history, Alexis de Tocqueville, his trip to the Great Lakes, where he witnessed, the most extraordinary spectacle he'd seen in his life, these absolutely pristine, beautiful waters, was in 1831. And the book I think many of us have probably read, Death and the Life of the Great Lakes, tells this story well, but so that was 1831. 3 years later, Cleveland would open its first manufacturing plant, and 30 years after that, the river started burning. And that is so crazy, from pristine to 35 years later, that state. And of course, it did for the next 101 years, periodically. So you fast forward to 69, and that was basically a small fire, comparatively. It was a blip, pretty much blip in Cleveland, plain dealer. It was, I think, 8th or 9th page of our local paper. Because it was normal. But, we were lucky. We had some things going for us. We had Carl Stokes as mayor of Cleveland at that time. In 69, he was serving as the nation's first African-American mayor of a major American city. And he was certainly under the microscope of the national media. And really, he chose to use the fire to highlight, of course, the legacy of environmental degradation found in a lot of industrial cities, but also especially its impact on the poor. It's clear he was way ahead of his time when we think about today in environmental justice. So, the day after the fire, again, wasn't huge news, but he brought the media down to the river to really shine a light on this event. So, he made it a big deal locally, but also federally. He teamed with his brother, Louis Stokes. He was a congressman at the time. And they basically led the charge to the nation's capital, and arguing that federal policy was absolutely necessary to support the local action. One of the other interesting things was that it was actually in 68 that Cleveland passed a $100 million water bond. So there was recognition before the fire that this was an issue. And it also shows that being prepared for an event like this, you can kind of take advantage of it, let's say. So all that action, I'd say, along with things like the Santa Barbara spill, a decade of advocacy helped lead a year later, 1970, to the creation of the U.S. EPA and the Clean Water Act a couple years later, as was mentioned. And so 50 years later, what do we have? We have this river that's alive again. We have, 70 species of fish now in the river, from Lake Erie walleye to steelhead trout. And this year officially designated that fish caught in the river are safe to eat as fish caught in the lake. And American Rivers actually named Cuyahoga the River of the Year in 2019. All good stuff, right? So we look back at that progress since '69. I think it's fair to say we see a river that was really unimaginable back then. And how did that happen? That was just determined local action over 50 plus years, supported by strong federal policy. And I think that's the formula for today's major threats. At least that's how we see it in the city. Of course, back then, it was industrial pollution. Point source pollution, of course, that was the major issue. That has largely been overtaken by issues today of algae blooms, things like plastic pollution, invasive species, certainly other threats, and all of that made worse by climate change, let's just say inequity in our society. So that's kind of the difference, right? Back then you could kind of place blame to some degree on a handful of manufacturers. I think we like to say that now really the problem is us, what we consume, how we farm, how we build and maintain cities, et cetera. But again, we see the overarching recipe for progress essentially the same. Local action supported by strong policy can make really unimaginable outcomes. So that kind of brings us to what's coming up. So throughout this year, we've created this thing called Cuyahoga 50. It's really this regional collaboration. So I would say to take advantage of this unique opportunity to engage a much wider audience in water issues. So it's kind of about learning from the past to inform how we tackle those current present-day challenges. The idea, which is kind of our larger Sustainable Cleveland approach, is to get every organization we could to integrate water, in this case, and sustainability into their programming. So over 200 organizations came together, including folks like the Alliance for the Great Lakes. We've hosted over 100 events this year, and many, from exhibits to sort of town halls, to debates, really anything you could imagine. There's been something around water to the point where people are probably tired of talking about it. But that was the goal, is that you would not be able to avoid this topic this year in Northeast Ohio. This is culminating, as was mentioned, soon, June 19th to the 23rd. One day wasn't enough, so we did 5 days of big events, 25 events over 5 days. So again, we invite you to Cleveland. Again, it's a big celebration, but it's also really talking a lot about these hard, challenging questions we face with water and sustainability. So Cuyahoga50.org is the spot. And the last thing I'll just mention quickly is, the mayor's initiative. So back in '09, Mayor Jackson launched Sustainable Cleveland 2019, a 10-year initiative to create what we call this green city on a blue lake. One reason we used 2019 was it was the 50th anniversary of this river burning, and we knew this would be a big deal. And you think back to '09 and the challenges, it's similar to in a way to '69 that, this was at the depth of the recession. Cleveland was hit harder than the vast majority of U.S. cities. And in fact, some people would say a couple of neighborhoods, including Southwick Village, was the epicenter of the recession. So we were putting out a lot of fires, pardon the pun, but we also realized, and the mayor realized, that as we kind of grow the economy back, we have to do that in a sustainable way. So that's what Sustainable Cleveland 2019 has been all about, kind of getting at some of these tough challenges that, aren't as simple, honestly, as getting at a few polluting manufacturers, but tackling things like clean energy, growing our tree canopy again, making sure every resident lives within, a 10-minute walk of a park, things like that. And so that's kind of what we're working on now, all of which, has a connection to clean water. So I'll stop there, but thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you, Matt. And now we're going to turn things over to Crystal Davis. Crystal?
Good afternoon, and thank you, Matt, for the historical component of it all. As mentioned, Cleveland was a cornerstone of a movement to clean our waters and work harder to protect our most precious natural resource. 1969 was a monumental time in U.S. history. The infamous Time magazine photo generated national conversation, stemmed the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency, the passage of the Federal Clean Water Act of 1972, the creation of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District in 1972, and renewed our commitment to appreciating the value of clean water. What I find most inspiring about the resurgence of the Cuyahoga River is that the movement was led in large part by the people impacted by the pollution. Their voices and stories were most compelling in the fight for clean water solutions. And just like Matt mentioned, Cleveland Mayor Carl Stokes, first Black mayor of a major city, held a press conference near the river the day after the historic fire. He also testified before Congress and advocated for greater federal involvement in pollution control. And he did that with his brother, Congressman Louis Stokes. 1 year later, Stokes convinced Cleveland voters to approve a $100 million bond to improve the city's sewer system. And the most amazing part about that was a substantial local commitment at that time when the U.S. government was only investing $185 million a year in similar infrastructure for the entire country. And so Cleveland was able to pass a $100 million bond at that time. Cleveland also had to battle state of Ohio laws that had few teeth to enforce water pollution standards and violations. In Cleveland, a number of Cleveland State University students celebrated the inaugural Earth Day that next year in 1970 by marching from campus to the river to protest pollution. This crusade for cleaner waters was a true partnership from the local level all the way to the federal government level. The undertaking required all hands on deck, people of all races, socioeconomic levels, communities, political affiliations, and backgrounds. Water and our need for it was the unifier. And I say it all the time. I believe that water is still the unifier and can be the unifier. Local reflection and representation, coupled with the power of media using their influence, has led to the revitalization of once blighted waters. The good news is that the Cuyahoga River has been restored and we have so much to celebrate this year. So I'm looking forward to attending the many events here in Cleveland. However, we cannot forget that there are new water challenges that need our attention. Green is in fact the new black. In 1969, we saw images of people putting their hands in the Cuyahoga River and pulling them out covered in thick black oil and other contaminants. Now headlines talk of harmful algal blooms in the western Lake Erie Basin, coupled with images of thick green algae. Green is, in fact, the new black. This growing issue warrants immediate action. Agricultural runoff is threatening our drinking water, fisheries, recreation, health, and our economy as well. The truth of the matter is that no one person or government entity is responsible for cleaning this up alone. Just like 1969, this challenge will require an all-hands-on-deck approach. We need to bring that same energy and passion that the Stokes brothers and others brought to the water threats of years past. This year marks the 5th anniversary of the Toledo water crisis. The devastating impacts of harmful algal blooms and the terror created 5 years ago is ingrained in the hearts and memory of so many Toledoans for years to come. And next, we'll pass the torch over to Mayor Kapsakavich to give an on-the-ground perspective from Toledo. Mayor, are you on the line?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this and for just allowing me to share my perspective on what happened in Toledo 5 years ago this August. Now, for what it is worth, just as a point of perspective, I was not the mayor 5 years ago, so there may be some aspects to the city's response that I, wouldn't be in a position to remember. But the staff that runs our water plant is by and large today the same staff that was there then. So I think I will be able to speak to the minutia if we want to get into the minutia, but certainly as someone who lived in Toledo 5 years ago, and I was an elected official, I was the county treasurer at the time, so I was in an elected position, though not directly related with that incident. I can talk about what it meant for our community, where we are now, and maybe where we'll head in the future. It was, it was a traumatic event for our community. I can still remember it as if it was yesterday. The news broke early on a Saturday morning. In fact, I think it was at 3 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday morning when most everyone was asleep. Really, this is late Friday night. Most people would have considered it Friday night, but it was really 3 in the morning on a Saturday. The crisis began, and for 2 days there's all sorts of drama that brought out both the best and worst of humanity. Let's be honest. The best part of it was sort of the feelings of camaraderie and neighborhood, people helping others, volunteerism, trying to get through this problem together. But there was also the worst parts of humanity: price gouging and runs, convenience stores charging incredible sums for the bottled water that they had. I might even say unreasonable panic descending upon average citizens of Toledo, driving up to Detroit, hoarding bottled water and coming back and developing like a black market for the commodity they had. In some sick ways, it almost reminded me a little bit of reading about the barter economy that broke out in the Warsaw Ghetto. Not to put too fine a point on it, but unfortunately, a lot of people looked at this as an opportunity to make money, and it was just awful. Because make no mistake, almost 500,000 people couldn't drink water for 2 days. But it's more than that. People focus on that maybe a little too much. When there's no water, there's also no surgery, So if you had a surgery scheduled for August 2nd, 2014, whether it was an emergency surgery or not, you weren't going to surgery that day. Businesses suffered. I mean, it was a traumatic event that made international news. And 5 years later, we're still dealing with the after effects of it. And it's still part of the narrative about our city, unfortunately. We understand how this problem happened. Part of it, we can't control. Part of it, humanity can control. I suppose the part we can't control is this. We live at the shallowest end of the shallowest Great Lake. Great Lakes are a wonderful resource for this region. 20% of all the uncapped fresh water on planet Earth is right in our backyard. Of those Great Lakes, Lake Erie is a strange place. It provides only 10% of the water, but 50% of the fish. So it's important for sportsmen and recreation and, frankly, the economy, because it is so shallow and because there are so much fish. One follows the other, of course. But because it is so shallow, it means it heats up more quickly. And even in the same Great Lake, folks near Buffalo and Niagara Falls, I mean, there are pockets where Lake Erie can, get to 100 feet deep, or, maybe a little more than 100 in some places. Heck, Lake Superior, it's 1,200 feet, 1,300 feet. In Toledo, it's 20 feet. It's really, really shallow here, which means it really, really warms up really quickly. And I'm not a scientist, as my clumsy remarks so far this afternoon indicate, but I know enough to say this, that there is something about the peculiar mixture of warm water and disgusting pollution and phosphorus runoff and nutrient, all that stuff, that makes for harmful algal blooms. There's something about it that causes that to be the case. And so the part of this we can't control is the fact that, either an ice age or God, depending on how theological you are, has placed us at the shallowest end of the shallowest Great Lake. But there is a part of it we can do something about, we meaning people at large, and that is we could not have so much enthusiastic zest for polluting it. There are a lot of fingers to point, I suppose. One of the big places to point a finger would be at things called CAFOs, Concentrated Animal Feeding Operations. These are not small mom and pop farms. These are megacorp, Death Star corporations that jam hundreds, if not thousands, of cows and pigs and chickens into tight little bins and manufacture every ounce of money out of their bodies that they can. And I get it. Anyone who looks at my waistline knows I love food. But the problem is these animals produce a lot of manure. And in the western Lake Erie Basin, they produce, and this is a little stomach turning, but this is how this conversation goes. Those CAFOs in the western Lake Erie Basin produce more manure than all of the waste that human beings create in the cities of Chicago and Los Angeles combined. So when you mix that amount of grossness in shallow, warm water, voila, you get a river and a lake that look like the Chicago River on St. Patrick's Day. And it's going to happen again this year. It happens every year. It doesn't happen in January or February, again, because the water's cooler. But you can pretty much set your clock to it that in, late August, early September, we're going to have some blooms and the water's going to be green. And especially a year like this, which is a year where we've had an incredible, literally a historic amount of rain, we know that amount of rain is going to help the, chemicals that our friends in the agricultural community put on their property. It's going to help that ooze even better and more efficiently in our water source. So you will, you'll be able to see Toledo will be the Emerald City for a couple days in September this year. Mark my words. Question is, what can we do about it? What have we done about it? I know that based on the notes I got for this call, there could be members of the media listening. I don't care. I'm not smart enough to know what's good for me, so I'm just going to say my piece. And I understand that in the fight to reclaim our river and lake, that there are roles for all of us to play. There are roles for smart academics, for professors, for science, for community activists, for business people, for a lot of different folks. I am happy to play the role of the villain, if that's what I need to be. Those of you of a certain age who remember the Iron Sheik from the World Wrestling Federation, I'll be that guy. I'll be the guy that takes all the arrows so the rest of you can actually get the job done. I'm not afraid to say what's the truth. I have been quoted as referring to the Farm Bureau. Quoted as referring to the Ohio legislature as a wholly owned subsidiary of the Farm Bureau. I've been quoted as saying that Ohio state government hates Toledo. And I use that word carefully and thoughtfully, knowing, of course, that the truth is always a defense. I say these things because I had the benefit of having the director of the Ohio EPA sitting in my office on the very table I'm sitting in right now, on the chair that I'm looking at. And he said to me, look, I know you're mad. Let me make this easy for you. I know who's causing this problem. It's not cities and their wastewater treatment plants. It's not anything else. It's agriculture. 92% of this comes from agriculture, comes from the nutrient runoff and the phosphorus. We don't need any more studies. We're done. We know who does this. And I'm thinking, geez, this would be the greatest meeting I've ever attended. Until with the very next words out of his mouth, he said, but the legislature won't let us regulate it. At which time it became the worst meeting I ever attended. But you know what? He's right. The legislature fundamentally is not going to impose meaningful regulations on a group of folks who form the political base of the people in charge. So it makes our challenge even tougher. When I meet with the new gang from DeWine's team, and by the way, I have a lot of respect for Governor DeWine. I am encouraged by the early months of his term. I think he's, bringing a seriousness and a focus on this issue that hasn't happened in a while. I worry about the legislature he has to work with, however. I've met with his team too, and they literally don't even utter the word regulation out loud. They refer to it as the R word. That's a frightening realization for someone like me who believes this problem ain't going away without the R word. You might be politically afraid to say it. That's the only thing that's going to solve this problem. Because Governor Kasich was here 5 years ago in the midst of the crisis and said all the things you'd expect a politician to say, lots of strong language about how we're going to reduce the phosphorus load, by 20% by 2020, and we'll reduce it by 45% by 2025, and it sounds great. And we already know that they're going to miss those bogeys horrendously. In some mathematical arguments, the problem is not getting better, it is getting worse. And what's going to happen when we fail to meet these voluntary measures? Well, you can rest assured the state will send a very sternly worded letter saying, please don't let this happen again, and maybe a little hand will come out of the envelope and slap someone on the wrist. The fact of the matter is, without some teeth, without some accountability, we're spinning our wheels. I am excited when I hear Governor DeWine talk about H2 Ohio. I really am. And the possibility of $1 billion is an exciting amount of money to be able to throw at this problem. I know Governor Kasich spent $3 billion in the years in the last years of his term, and spending $3 billion. What did it get us? We're going backwards. The problem is getting worse. Why? Because there's no accountability. There's no R word, there's no regulation, which is the only thing that's going to make a difference here. So I am excited that we have a coalition, including the one that joins us today, that's passionate about this issue. And if my role is as of the cynical SOB who has to call names to get attention, I'm happy to do it. Because if anyone is supposed to be angry and righteously indignant, it has to be the mayor of the city whose citizens couldn't drink the water for a couple of days a couple of years ago. And I want the problem to be fixed, and I'm just worried that the political landscape we have in our state right now is one that's going to make it very difficult for us. I'd love to be proven wrong, and I'd love to work with your group to help prove me wrong. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you to all of our speakers, to Crystal and Matt as well. And what I really hear loud and clear is that the experience that we've had coming from what happened in the Cuyahoga and the role that Cleveland played up to today, and the spectrum that we've got now between where we've been and what we've been able to accomplish, and the challenges that we still have in front of us, it's pretty remarkable. And it's remarkable that that's playing out in two cities that are just separated by a few miles of water on the same Great Lake. The other thing is that this isn't something, this issue of how we're going to deal with our clean water challenges today that are coming from places that are not regulated is actually not exclusive to these two cities or to Lake Erie. Lake Erie is, I would say, the most vivid example of where we don't yet have the tools to solve this problem, but it's a problem that's showing up across the region and across the country. And whether you use the Great Lakes for swimming or boating or for drinking water like we all do, this problem is probably affecting you in some way, or a community that you live near in some way right now. And so I want to talk a little bit about actions you can take and what we need to do to solve the problem. And I'll emphasize that, as you can probably tell, solving this problem is not something that's going to happen overnight. There was a commitment made in 2015 to reduce the amount of phosphorus going into Lake Erie by 40% by 2025. And as you heard from the mayor, we are not making progress on that commitment, but we have to stick to the commitments we've made. And that means figuring out how to make tough decisions about how to reduce pollution going into Lake Erie in all of our waters. And to do that, we're going to need support from all sectors. And I'll name a few. So of course, the cities we have on the phone today, but businesses and utilities and the public health community, and especially from agriculture. We definitely need support from all those sectors. Second, we need to know that support means not just words and not just plans, but it means timelines for success. We've got a 2025 deadline for Lake Erie, but we're going to need to get much more specific than that. We need to tie the dollars we spend to specific places and specific practices. We need analytics that tell us whether pollution reduction is actually happening, and a willingness to change course quickly if the path we are on is not working. And of course, we need more funding, but we've got to remember that these are taxpayer dollars that we're spending. We need to be assured that when we choose to spend, there will be a return on investment. So we need that spending to be tied to accountability measures, so we pay for changes that actually result in clean water performance. And we also can't afford to isolate problems like toxic algae in Western Lake Erie from larger clean water funding challenges like crumbling wastewater and drinking water infrastructure. We'll need integrated water investment strategies that meet the diverse needs of people across the Great Lakes. Now, if you are an Ohioan, there is something you can do today. As you heard already, since the beginning of his term, Ohio Governor Mike DeWine has made Lake Erie the center of his environmental priorities and has proposed spending nearly $1 billion of state money to address the runoff problem. And this has been met with multiple other proposals for funding from the legislators. This is good, and these are important steps. But we need that funding to be tied to clean water performance and targeted to places that are the biggest pollution hotspots, and we need additional protections put in place. And so if you're an Ohioan, we're asking you to contact Governor DeWine today and your legislators and make sure they know how important clean water is to you. If you live somewhere else, because I know people are listening from across the Great Lakes region, we're asking you to sign a pledge today that you will stand up for clean water to solve these problems, and we'll be following up with you later this year with more action opportunities based on where you live. And so now I'm going to turn things back over to Jen Caddick, who's going to manage our Q&A.
Thanks so much, Joel, and thank you so much, Mayor Kapsakavich, Matt, and Crystal, for your thoughtful and interesting remarks. For those of you participating on the line, you can ask questions via the chat box. As a reminder, because we have so many folks attending the call, the lines for attendees are muted, but we will keep an eye out on the question box and try and get to as many as we can in the remaining 20 minutes of our conversation here. And to get things started a little bit, as Mayor Kapsakavich mentioned, as well as Joel and Crystal, there's a lot happening right now in the Ohio State Legislature as the state considers and pulls together its budget package. Mayor, we heard you loud and clear on the accountability issue. That's certainly a concern and a question we have about a lot of these proposals. And so, Crystal and Joel, perhaps you could just sort of fill us in a little bit on specifics as far as what we know generally about what's being sort of debated and discussed right now in the state capitol. Crystal?
Sure. First, I'd like to say, we applaud Governor DeWine for making Lake Erie a priority from day zero. He started off talking about Lake Erie, and there is a lot of momentum in the Ohio legislature for this issue. And so we have a number of proposals that have been introduced, which is a good problem to have in a Great Lakes state. We know that Senate Bill 2, which creates a statewide watershed planning and management program, and also creates a pilot program aimed at reducing phosphorus in watersheds, passed the Senate this week. And then on the funding side, we know that Governor DeWine has introduced the H2 Ohio plan, and the legislature has introduced House Bill 7, which is their version of a funding plan. Basically, these funding proposals will make sizable investments to protect Ohio's water quality over several years. They include prevention and land-based programs, water-based restoration programs, and support for science, research, and measurements. Jen, just like you said a minute ago, the thing that we're seeing missing from the proposals at the state level is accountability. We want to make sure that we're getting a return on our investment as taxpayers, and that all of the efforts that are being supported are resulting in clean water outcomes. And so that is what we are advocating for at the state level with our partners.
Thanks, Crystal. Joel or Mayor Kapsakavich, do you want to add anything to your thoughts on what's happening in the state capitol beyond what Crystal has mentioned? Oh, that's okay. So I have a question here from our audience about asking if Michigan and Canada are participating or collaborating with Ohio on some of these Lake Erie and other cleanup efforts that have been proposed, and that's a great point, because obviously Ohio is just one of the many states and jurisdictions that borders Lake Erie. And so, Joel, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about the regional collaboration that's happening on some of these issues.
Sure. In 2015, an agreement was committed to by the governors of Ohio and Michigan and the Premier of Ontario in Canada to reduce phosphorus going into Lake Erie by 40% from each of those jurisdictions. Indiana has done some work on this through the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement as well, which is another international agreement. And so you do have provinces and states involved in this effort. On the ground, Ohio certainly has the largest share of phosphorus to reduce because of the vast amount of agricultural land active in Ohio. And so that 40% commitment for a reduction of phosphorus by 2025 is something that we were really glad to see put in place in 15, but we're also need to push really hard to make that goal, which is right now, as the mayor said, and as the previous administration showed in Ohio, we're not making progress on the reduction commitments that have been made. And so we do see that international attention. We also know that a big part of that burden does fall on the state of Ohio.
Thanks, Joel. I guess I'll pivot over to Matt. A question for you and your perspective from Cleveland. You know, one of the things we've talked about a little bit on this webinar, and I'm seeing a couple questions on this, is you know, we've seen this tremendous success around the restoration and cleanup of the Cuyahoga River, which is such a symbol for the national environmental movement in the Great Lakes region. And we're seeing a lot of those successes around the region. But then obviously we have these other significant problems like harmful algal blooms. And I'm just curious what kind of thoughts you might have for other cities around the region, or even your own city, as we start to tackle some of these new problems. Do you have any lessons learned or big picture ideas from the history that you so wonderfully overviewed of the restoration of the Cuyahoga River, and what we can apply that to some of our new challenges?
Certainly. I think, you know, I talked a little bit about it, but I think the major lesson that I took from 69 was that, you know, it just seems like, you know, looking back on history, it just naturally happened, right? You know, oh, the fire happened, and then we made a big deal out of it, and we took it to Congress, and then we got US EPA, you know, we got the Clean Water Act. And it wasn't that simple, right? That was building on a decade of, you know, growing activism around water pollution, but especially in Cleveland, air pollution as well. And I think, as was mentioned, as Crystal mentioned, the water bond issue. I mean, this was something that we were thinking about for a while back then, and had put actually money towards, and could speak with authority to the point where, you know, yes, local government can do a lot, especially when citizens and residents demand action. But we can't do it all, especially in these big issues, these big regional issues. And I think, so when the fire happened, we could go to Congress, and Mayor Stokes could go to Congress and make that case that we need federal support. So that was, to me, one big lesson. And the other lesson that we focused on is really local government really serving as a collaborator and a convener, and not coming to everything with solutions all the time. And this is what Sustainable Cleveland 2019 has tried to do. You know, government certainly has a role, but we need everyone, business, retirees, students, the nonprofit sector, et cetera, at the table, and to kind of build over time that strong foundation for action, again, to be kind of ready for opportunity. So that's kind of been a couple of lessons that I've taken from 50 years ago, but also through our initiative.
Thanks, Matt. Oh, Joel, do you want to add in?
Just a quick comment on that. I appreciated those thoughts, Matt. And I just wanted to emphasize, The pathway here goes through building powerful coalitions that can really make sure that clean water is working for everybody. I heard from the mayor's comments about the difficulty of getting mandatory protections in the legislature, and I think that speaks to the need to make this something that you can't say no to. And I think that's the power in bringing all those voices to the table and making sure that we can make clean water protections something that it's impossible to say no to, and that's what's going to be needed to, at least in part, to turn the tide.
The next question I have is for Mayor Kapszukiewicz. I have a number of questions from our listeners around the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, which was certainly a new approach and new idea that sort of took hold in Toledo area. And I'm wondering if you could just explain to our listeners what that is and what the current status is and what that might mean for the lake.
I'm going to try real hard not to be, well, the someone who just saddens and depresses everyone on this call. So I'll tell you what it is, and I'll try my best to hold my tongue about what the legislature's reaction to it was. It was an initiative, a citizen-driven initiative. So you had citizens of Toledo and activists come together on their own and crafted ballot language, put on the ballot, and then passed a measure that it was called the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, and it would afford Lake Erie in some ways, depending on your view of the law, certain rights, legal rights, almost equivalent to the rights of personhood, some would argue. This is something that they've done in Australia and some other places around the world. The idea being that that Lake Erie should have, maybe we wouldn't pollute our lake and our waterways if they had, if doing so was viewed criminally the same way that harming a human being would be. I mean, I'm trying to explain it in sort of layman's terms. And so it passed. It is uncertain whether the Lake Erie Bill of Rights is going to hold up in court. Of course, it was challenged a few minutes after it went into effect, and it's winding its way through the court system. And knowing the sort of court system we have in this state, it's almost certain to be declared unconstitutional. That's my prediction. Nonetheless, I view it as an important, almost a primal scream of anger coming from this part of the state that if it does nothing else, it is a signal to Columbus that just says, hey, don't forget us up here. Please stop ignoring us. Look what you've done. Here we are. We're waving our arms. Look at us up here. We got a problem. Try not to ignore us like you like doing. So if it does nothing other than get the attention of our state leaders, then I think it's been valuable. Sadly, and here's where I try not to be cynical, it has gotten the attention of our state leaders. What did the state Senate do just earlier this week? They passed a bill to emasculate it and undo it, taking away home rule authority in the process. So, this is going to be a theme I keep coming back to, that we do have a citizens movement. We do have some, we have some power. We got people. The people are on our side. I think the common sense is on our side. We don't got enough politicians on our side. We just don't. We have a group of folks in Columbus and elsewhere that just are not as engaged as we'd like them to be, to put it politely. So even when we do something like the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, 2 days ago, they're passing a bill in the Ohio Senate that says, thanks, but no thanks. It's not the sort of warm welcome we wish we were getting. And so one of, I guess, my recommendations would be that as we go forward, I mean, let's just, this is just my view on it, okay? And you guys can, ignore it. I don't care. This is all about politics. This is politics. It's not about science. We know what the science says. This isn't about, we know who's causing the problem. We know we don't need any more studies. This is just politics. So if this is politics, how can we get through politically to a group that specializes in ignoring us? And my belief is that we will make some progress on this if we can start identifying allies who maybe aren't ideologically the same as I am. So, I love, the sort of militant activist environmental set. I love it. The folks who chain themselves to a redwood and so it doesn't get chopped down, the 3 Mile Island crowd, I love them. Love it. If those are the only people who we have in our group, the legislators are going to keep ignoring us. They're just going to keep not caring. But if we can get folks who are maybe a little more conservative, maybe on the right side of the political spectrum, because let's be honest, who runs state government and who has run it for 30 almost uninterrupted years. To put it more bluntly, if we can get Republicans on our side, and there are plenty of them. The CEO of Cedar Fair, the name is escaping me, but his business is directly related to the health of the lake. And he's a Republican. When he starts complaining, when he gets in Governor DeWine's ear, when the CEO of one of the Fortune 500 companies in my city, Owens Corning, when they start talking to the legislature and say, hey, this isn't just left-wing environmental folks who care about this. This is us too. That's when I think we turn the page and make a difference. But those are just my 2 cents.
Thanks so much, Mayor, for those thoughts. Appreciate it. We are reaching the end of our hour, and so I'm going to turn it over to, again, to Joel Bremeyer and let him wrap it up.
Thanks, Jen. I think that's a great perspective to end on, because the reality in the Great Lakes region is that we've got a great track record for success at getting things done when we can build broad coalitions that can ask for things that seem impossible. And I think that that's going to be what's needed to solve this problem, and recognize that the people that are being affected by the challenges in Lake Erie and the clean water challenges across the Great Lakes region are people from all political stripes, as Crystal said earlier, from all socioeconomic strata, all races, and all places. And so while we can't be naive about the challenge, we do need to band together and make sure that we are making it hard to say no to clean water. So I appreciate everybody listening today. And of course, you can always reach out to the Alliance with any additional questions. I hope you learned something. And I appreciate the efforts of our speakers to step in today from 2 great cities on Lake Erie and give us their perspectives. We look forward to working with all of you more on protecting the Great Lakes and clean water. And thanks so much for taking the time.
Thanks, everyone.